I never thought a paper crane could break me. But there I was, standing in the middle of a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, holding a folded piece of notebook paper, the kind torn from a cheap composition book, with my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep it open. And when I finally understood what it meant, when I finally saw the full picture of what Elias Monroe had been carrying for the last 3 years, completely alone, I sat down on the floor right there in that hallway and I wept. Not the polite kind of crying you do at funerals where you're watching your face in someone else's expression, the ugly kind. The kind that comes from your chest. The kind that makes you realize you were looking at something sacred the entire time and treating it like it was nothing. I need you to stay with me here, because this story doesn't start where you think it starts, and it doesn't end where you think it ends. In fact, everything I'm about to tell you, everything I believed about Elias for 3 full years, was a story I built in my own head. A comfortable, lazy story. The kind of story you build about someone when you don't bother to look closer. I want you to hear this one, because I think you might have an Elias in your life. And I almost let mine disappear. I met Elias Monroe on the first day of 8th grade. It was one of those September mornings in western Pennsylvania, where the air can't quite decide if it's still summer or already fall, cool enough to wear a hoodie, warm enough to regret it by noon. Our middle school, Hartwell Prep, wasn't anything glamorous. Red brick building, one broken water fountain that had been broken since before any of us were born. A cafeteria that smelled permanently of industrial cleaner and baked ziti. The kind of place that exists in every mid-size American town, unremarkable, familiar, the kind of school where social hierarchies are set by October and rarely disturbed. I walked into homeroom early that morning, which was unusual for me. Normally I slid into my seat just before the bell, but something had made me anxious that first day. Some vague sense that 8th grade was going to matter in ways I didn't fully understand yet. The room was nearly empty. 2 girls were already sharing earbuds in the back corner. Marcus Webb, who would become my closest friend that year, was sprawled in the front row, pretending to be asleep. And in the far seat by the window, third from the last, sat a boy I had never seen before. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. He was just sitting. His backpack was already off and sitting neatly under his chair. His notebook was already open. He wasn't on a phone. I noticed that because every other kid in the room either had a phone out or looked naked without one. He was just sitting with his hands folded on the desk, looking out the window at the parking lot like he was watching something important happen out there. I followed his gaze. There was nothing out there. Just cars. Just asphalt. His name, I would learn when Mrs. Calloway read the roll, was Elias Monroe. He raised one finger when she called it, not a full hand, not a wave, just one finger. Barely above the desk, and then he went back to looking at whatever he saw out that window. I remember thinking, new kid, probably nervous. That was the whole thought. That was the complete sentence I wrote about Elias in my head that morning. New kid, probably nervous. I couldn't have been more wrong. And I wouldn't realize it for a very long time. I should tell you something about myself. Because this story doesn't belong only to Elias. It belongs to who I was then, too. My name is Daniel Reeves, and at 13 I was the kind of kid who was just comfortable enough to be invisible to authority and just social enough to avoid being a target. I wasn't popular in any formal sense. I wasn't an athlete. I wasn't in the honors track. I occupied that comfortable middle ground at Hartwell where nobody particularly celebrated you and nobody particularly bothered you either. Marcus and I had been friends since 5th grade. bound together by a shared love of basketball and a shared talent for doing the absolute minimum amount of work required to pass any given class. I tell you this because I want you to understand who was watching Elias. Not a hero. Not a particularly perceptive person. Just a regular kid with regular blind spots trying to get through the year. And Elias was from every angle I looked at him during those first weeks, simply the quiet kid. He sat in the same window seat every day, even after we were allowed to choose our own. He ate lunch alone at the end of the second table from the door. Not with the hunched resentment of someone who'd been rejected, but with a focused stillness that was almost more unsettling. He never raised his hand in class. He never got in trouble. He turned in every assignment. I noticed this because Mrs. Calloway would sometimes make a small, approving noise when she collected from his row, the kind of noise teachers make when they're surprised. He was always the first one to pack up when a bell rang and always the last one out the door. I noticed that contradiction later. At the time, I noticed nothing. What I did notice, what eventually cracked through my indifference, happened on a Thursday in early October. It was a half day. One of those teacher development afternoons where school let out at noon and the energy in the building was chaotic and gleeful. I had stayed late to help Marcus find a jacket he'd left in the gym, and by the time we made it back to the main hallway, it was almost empty. Most kids had flooded out to waiting cars or the buses already. The hallway had that particular hollow quality that buildings get when they're usually full and suddenly aren't. That's when I saw Elias at his locker. He had his back to me, and he didn't know I was there. He had his phone out, the first time I'd ever seen him use it. And he was reading something on the screen with a posture I'd never seen from him before. Every other time I'd seen Elias, even from a distance, he carried himself with this almost eerie possession. But right now, his shoulders were curved inward. His free hand had come up and was pressed flat against the locker door in front of him, like he needed something solid to hold on to. He stood like that for almost a full minute. Then he straightened up, put the phone in his pocket, closed his locker with a careful click, and walked toward the exit with the same measured pace he always had, like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just seen something crack open and then seal itself shut. Marcus was talking beside me, something about basketball tryouts, and I answered him. And I kept walking, and I told myself I hadn't seen anything unusual at all. But something stayed with me, something small and uncomfortable and unresolved. And I learned later that those small, uncomfortable, unresolved things are usually trying to tell you something important. I just wasn't ready to listen yet. October became November, and the first frost came, and Hartwell Prep settled into its winter rhythm. Basketball tryouts happened, and Marcus made the JV team, and I didn't, and that occupied most of my emotional bandwidth for a couple of weeks. I watched Elias, from the peripheral awareness you give to background details, the hum of the heater, the flicker of the fluorescent light over the water fountain, the quiet boy at the window seat. Two things happened in November that I would only understand much later. The first, Elias started leaving school differently. Not by a lot. Just sometimes during lunch, instead of sitting at his usual spot, he'd be gone. Not in the bathroom. Not in the library, where Mrs. Whitfield, the librarian, would later tell me he spent considerable time. Just gone. And then he'd be back in fifth period with that same settled composure, like he'd simply stepped out of time for 40 minutes and returned unmarked. The second thing, he helped me. It happened in math class. Mr. Dvorak had assigned one of his signature torture problems, a multi-step algebra problem with about 4 places you could go wrong, and I had gone wrong in all 4 of them. The class period was almost over, and I still had a page of scratchwork that led nowhere. And I had that particular flavor of frustration that comes from knowing you're almost out of time and still completely lost. Elias sat one row over and one seat back. I don't know what made him do it. I hadn't said anything out loud, but he slid a folded piece of paper across the aisle to my desk, so smoothly and quietly that Mr. Dvorak, who was grading papers at the front, didn't see it. I opened it. It was my problem, my same problem, worked out in small, precise handwriting, step by step, with each step labeled. Not just the answer, the whole path. Like he'd watched me get lost and decided to draw me a map. I looked at him. He was already looking at the board. He didn't acknowledge the exchange, didn't look for gratitude, didn't even glance at me to see if I'd gotten the note. I used the steps. I got the problem right. When the bell rang, I said, "Hey, thanks." And Elias looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as briefly surprised, like the thank you was unexpected. And he said, "It's a tricky setup," and that was it. He picked up his bag and walked out. And I stood there in the doorway feeling, for a reason I couldn't articulate, like I'd just touched the edge of something much larger than a math problem. We started talking after that. Slowly, the way conversations begin when one person is very private, and the other person doesn't quite know how to bridge the distance without forcing it. I'd fall into step with him in the hallway sometimes and make some comment about class, and he'd respond briefly, thoughtfully, always with more precision than the moment seemed to call for. He was never cold. He was never dismissive. He just offered exactly what the conversation required, and nothing more, like he was careful about how much of himself he spent. I started to notice other things during those weeks. His clothes were always clean, but they were the same rotation. 3 or 4 outfits cycling through the week with a reliability that only became visible once I was paying attention. Not cheap clothes, exactly, but worn. A gray hoodie with a small frayed hem. Dark jeans that had been washed so many times, the black had faded blue. His sneakers were old, but always clean, spotless even on muddy days. Which struck me as odd, in the way small, inexplicable details strike you as odd when you can't yet explain them. He never bought lunch. This I noticed because Marcus and I went through the hot lunch line almost every day, and Elias was never in it. He ate from a bag. Always. The same brown paper bag, folded over at the top, with the same neat crease, containing a sandwich and something small, an apple. A handful of crackers, eaten with that same concentrated focus he brought to everything. I told myself this was nothing. Some families packed lunches. Lots of kids packed lunches. I told myself a lot of things that winter that turned out not to be the whole truth. December arrived with the particular desperation of a school month that promises vacation and delivers final exams first. Everyone was exhausted and frantic and running on cafeteria cookies and competitive anxiety. And in all of that noise, Elias became somehow even quieter than he already was. There was a moment in the second week of December that I keep coming back to. We had an English project, a creative presentation, where each student had to choose a piece of literature and explain what it meant to them personally. Most kids chose short things, song lyrics, a poem they liked, a movie that was based on a book so technically counted. Elias chose The Old Man and the Sea. He stood at the front of the class and he talked about it for 7 minutes, exactly the assigned length. And what he said was unlike anything any other 8th grader said that day. He talked about what it meant to struggle with something so large that no one around you could fully see it. He talked about how the old man was alone on the water, not because he had been abandoned, but because some struggles are, by their nature, solitary. He talked about dignity, about how you could be losing, visibly and completely, and still be conducting yourself with something that looked like grace. Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "Elias, that was really remarkable," with a tone I'd never heard her use before. Not the performative encouragement she gave most students, but something quieter and more genuine. Elias nodded once, said thank you, and returned to his seat. I looked at him for a long time after that presentation, and for the first time, the thought I had wasn't new kid, probably nervous. The thought I had was, he is talking about something real. I didn't know what that something was yet. But what I discovered over the following weeks changed everything I thought I understood about him. We broke for winter vacation and came back in January, and something had shifted in Elias. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to someone who hadn't been paying the particular kind of attention I'd started paying. But he was more tired, not sleepy tired, something deeper. The kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and doesn't go away with a night of good sleep. He was still turning in every assignment, still sitting at the window seat, still eating from the brown paper bag. But in late January, I caught something I shouldn't have. We were in the library during a free period. I was there genuinely avoiding an essay, and Elias was there, doing whatever it was Elias did in the library, which usually involved sitting in the back corner with a book and a notebook. I was at one of the computer stations near the back, and I needed to print something, and the printer was on the table near where he was sitting. And as I walked over, I caught a glimpse of what was on the table in front of him. It wasn't a book. It was a printout, several pages. The kind of dense text you get from a medical or insurance website, and in the margins. In his small, precise handwriting, he had made notes, numbers, dates, short phrases I couldn't read from the angle I was at. One word I did catch before he noticed me and turned the pages face down, coverage. He looked up at me with that expression again, the briefly surprised one. But this time, there was something else underneath it. A fraction of a second of something that looked almost like fear. Then it was gone, and he said, "Printing something." "Yeah," I said. "Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt." "You're not interrupting," he said, and he meant it. But he had stacked the papers neatly and put his hand on top of them, and we both understood that the conversation was not going to go where I had half wanted it to go. I took my printout and walked back to my computer and sat there for a long time without looking at the screen. My essay stayed unwritten. My mind was somewhere else entirely. I wish I had asked him. Right there, in that library, I wish I had just asked. But I wasn't ready for what might come next. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I was probably misreading things. I am telling you now, in case you are ever in that library with that person in your own life, ask. Whatever you are afraid of hearing, ask anyway. I didn't. And the weight of that stayed with me for months. February came in ugly that year, one of those winters that doesn't commit to snow, but delivers weeks of cold gray rain that soaks into everything. The building at Hartwell smelled permanently of wet coat and muddy sneaker, and everyone was running on fumes by the third week. Valentine's Day happened, and paper hearts went up on classroom doors, and someone filled Marcus's locker with candy because he had admirers he refused to acknowledge. And life at Hartwell conducted itself with its usual self-absorbed energy. Elias missed 3 days that week. He'd never missed school before. Not one day in the whole first semester. I knew this because Mrs. Calloway had mentioned it once, casually. the way teachers mention things that quietly impress them. Perfect attendance. Not in a trying to win an award way. Just there, every single day, every single morning, at the window seat before anyone else arrived. 3 days. Then he was back on Thursday. Same clothes, same composure, same brown bag. Marcus noticed, which surprised me, because Marcus was not in the habit of tracking Elias Monroe, and said during lunch, "Quiet kid was out this week." "Weird," I said. I noticed. And Marcus moved on, because Marcus was already talking about basketball and a girl named Priya, who sat next to him in science and approximately 4 other subjects at once, which was the normal state of being for Marcus Webb. But when I passed Elias in the hallway that Thursday, I stopped. "Hey," I said. "You okay?" He looked at me. Something moved behind his expression, not the surprise this time. Something closer to the way a door looks for a half-second before it closes. Then he said, "Yeah. Thanks for asking." And the way he said, "Thanks for asking," quietly, with a weight on those 3 words that they don't usually carry, made my chest tight in a way I couldn't explain. Like he meant it in a way that went beyond the words. Like nobody had asked. Maybe nobody had. "I want to tell you about the paper cranes, because they are important, and because they were right there in front of me for months, and I was too busy looking at other things to see them." Elias folded paper cranes. I'd seen him do it during free periods, while waiting for the bell. Sometimes in the margins of class time when Mr. Dvorak had turned to write on the board. Small, precise cranes from squares of notebook paper. I'd assumed it was a fidget thing, a nervous habit, something to do with his hands. I counted them once, not intentionally, but because I happened to be watching, and he happened to be folding, and I got to 7 before the bell rang. 7 cranes in a free period, each one identical, each one slipped into his jacket pocket. I found out, later, what he did with them, but I wasn't ready for that yet either. The cranes stayed in the back of my mind like a thread I'd noticed but hadn't followed. Small and seemingly unimportant in the way that the most important things often are. March brought something I hadn't expected. Elias talked to me, really talked. Okay, not the brief, precise exchanges of the hallway, a real conversation. It happened after school on a Tuesday. I'd stayed late for a makeup quiz in history and was walking out alone. Marcus had practiced, and Elias was sitting on the steps outside the main entrance. Not waiting for a bus. Not on his phone. Just sitting, looking at the parking lot with that same quality of attention. He gave 2 things that probably looked like nothing from the outside. I almost walked past him. Then I didn't. I sat down on the step beside him, maybe 3 feet of space between us, and I didn't say anything for a minute. He didn't say anything either. It was actually comfortable in a way I wouldn't have predicted. Then he said, without any preamble or leaden, "Do you know what it costs for a home health aide? Like per hour?" I looked at him. His voice had been completely steady. He was still looking at the parking lot. "No," I said. "It's around $25 to $30 an hour," he said. "Depending on the level of care required. If someone needs specialized care, like occupational therapy visits, or help with specific medical needs, it's more." He said it like he was reciting something he'd memorized. Because he had. I didn't say anything. I waited. "My mom is sick," he said. Still steady. Still looking at the parking lot. "She's been sick for about 3 years. It started before we moved here. She has MS, multiple sclerosis, the kind that progresses. She was okay for a while, the early kind, where you have episodes and then you recover, mostly. But it changed. Last year and a half, It changed. I still didn't speak. Something told me that any sound I made would be the wrong one. My dad works double shifts at the distribution center, Elias continued. He leaves at 4:30 in the morning and he's home by 8 or 9 at night. Most nights she's asleep by the time he gets home. She has good days and bad days. On bad days, she can't do much. She can't always drive. She can't always cook. He paused. I take care of a lot of stuff. He said this last sentence, the way you state a fact you have long since stopped being upset about. Like the sky is blue, like water is cold. I take care of a lot of stuff. I make lunch every morning, he said, for both of us. I help her with her exercises when she has them. I manage the medication schedule. There's a board in the kitchen with all the times. I do the grocery order online every Sunday because she has a hard time standing for long in stores now. I do laundry on Saturday. He stopped. I realized I hadn't been breathing normally. I'm not telling you this he paused, choosing the word carefully. I'm not telling you this because I want anything. I think I needed to say it to someone. He finally turned and looked at me. You asked if I was okay. Back in February. Nobody else asked. I looked at him and I thought about all the months I had been sitting 10 feet from this person and building a comfortable, lazy story in my head. Quiet kid. Probably shy. Probably just like that. Elias, I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected. How long have you been doing this? The serious caregiving, about 18 months. He looked back at the parking lot. But I've been helping since before that. It kind of just increased gradually. You don't notice how much it's grown until you try to think back and you can't actually remember what it was like when it was less. The late bus came and went in the parking lot. Neither of us moved. Does anyone at school know? I asked. Mrs. Whitfield, the librarian, he said. She figured some of it out. She lets me use the printer for free. She doesn't make me explain. He almost smiled. She just accommodates. I thought about the papers I'd seen on the library table. The medical printouts. The coverage notes. I'm trying to figure out some programs, he said, like he'd read my memory. There are some assistance programs for families in our situation, income-based. I've been researching them. I've been researching them. A 13-year-old boy in the school library during free periods, researching home healthcare assistance programs so his father didn't have to. I didn't say anything for a long time. Then I said, "Can I help?" He looked at me again. That expression, the one that moved behind his eyes, and this time I knew what it was. It was the expression of someone who has been alone with something very heavy for so long that they've forgotten they're allowed to put it down. I don't know, he said honestly. I haven't really thought about what that would look like. Me neither, I said. But I'd like to try to figure it out, if you want. He nodded once. Not dramatically, not with relief or collapse. Just nodded, the way someone nods when something registers as true. We sat on the steps for another 20 minutes and talked about small things after that. Basketball, a book he was reading. The strange way Mr. Dvorak always smelled faintly of cinnamon. And it was the most normal, easy conversation I had ever had with Elias Monroe. And it happened there on the school steps with the weight of everything. He'd just told me, still sitting between us, like something solid. I walked home that evening, and I sat in my room and I thought about the paper cranes. I still didn't know about the paper cranes. But I was beginning to understand that every single thing about Elias was connected to something I hadn't seen yet. And I was beginning to understand that what I hadn't seen was the whole story. I told Marcus. I want to be honest about that, Elias had trusted me with something private, and I told Marcus, and I did it because I was 14, and I didn't know how to carry it alone, and Marcus was the only person I trusted completely. I told him quietly, away from the cafeteria noise. And Marcus, who was louder than anyone in our grade, who communicated largely through jokes and gestures, who had never in 4 years of friendship given me any indication that he was capable of stillness, went completely quiet. Then he said, "That's why he's always leaving at lunch." I looked at him. What? I've seen him leave. Not every day, but sometimes. He walks, there's a neighborhood about 6 blocks up. You can see it from the gym windows. I always thought he was going to the corner store or something. He paused. He's going home to check on her. I hadn't known this. 6 blocks. Leaving during lunch. Walking 6 blocks. Doing whatever needed to be done. Walking 6 blocks back. Arriving at 5th period with that settled composure. Every time. No one the wiser. What do we do? Marcus asked. And I realized that Marcus asking what do we do was perhaps one of the kindest things I had ever witnessed, because it meant he had taken less than 60 seconds to move from being told to deciding it was his problem too. Not in a savior way. Not in the way of people who want credit for caring. He just immediately enrolled in the situation, the same way he enrolled in basketball or a group project, completely, practically, without drama. I don't know yet, I said. Okay, Marcus said. Let's figure it out. We figured out small things first. This is important, because I think when people hear a story like Elias's, they imagine the help as something grand and categorical. It wasn't. It was small. It was the kind of help that looks like nothing from the outside. Marcus started sitting with Elias at lunch, not inviting himself in a pushy way, just appearing, setting his tray down, treating it as completely natural. Elias absorbed this without comment after the first time. By the second week, it was just the 3 of us. And the table that had been Elias's solitary geography for months became something else. I started walking with him sometimes, on the days he went home during lunch. Not every day, I didn't want to crowd him, and some days he went alone, and I had understood that some errands are private and some silences need to stay unwitnessed. But on the days he let me come, I went, and I met his mother. Her name was Patricia Monroe. And she was, I want you to picture this correctly. She was not the vision of illness that I had unconsciously prepared for. She was sitting in the living room of their apartment in a reclining chair with a blue throat blanket, and she was reading a novel. And when we walked in, she looked up, and her face lit with a brightness that rearranged everything. She was lovely. She had Elias's eyes, that same quality of careful, precise attention. She had a warmth that came out immediately and completely, the kind of warmth that makes a room feel physically warmer. She said, "You must be Daniel," with such genuine pleasure that I felt for a strange second like I was the one being welcomed into something special. "Eli talks about you," she said. And something in my chest moved oddly because I realized that Elias, who told no one anything, had been telling his mother about me. She asked me questions about school, real questions, the kind adults ask when they're actually interested and not just being polite. She laughed at something I said, a real laugh, clear and full. And the whole time, Elias moved through the apartment quietly behind us, checking something on the stove, refilling her glass of water, adjusting something on the medication board in the kitchen, and she watched him do it with an expression that I felt all the way across the room. It was love. Of course, it was love. But it was the particular love of someone watching someone they love sacrifice for them and being helpless to stop it. It was love mixed with grief, mixed with a kind of awe. She watched her son refill her water glass, and her face held something I have never forgotten and have never been able to fully name. On the walk back to school, I said to Elias, "She's amazing." He said, "Yeah," and the single word carried everything. Spring arrived in April, and with it the kind of hope that Pennsylvania springs always carry tentative. Breakable, still worth having. The trees outside Hartwell went from bare, black branches to that impossible green that only lasts about 2 weeks before it darkens into summer. Elias began to, I don't want to say open, because he had always been there. Become visible might be more accurate. Visible to us, and occasionally to others. He answered more questions in class, still with that same precision, but more willingly. He ate lunch with Marcus and me every day now, and sometimes other people would drift over Priya from Marcus's science class. A girl named Sophia, who was in my English section and had a laugh, like a sudden sound system turning on. And Elias absorbed these people the way he seemed to absorb everything, quietly. Without drama, with a quality of attention that made whoever he was talking to feel unexpectedly seen. I caught Sophia saying to me once, in a low voice after Elias had said something particularly perceptive during a conversation, "He's not what I thought he was." "What did you think he was?" I asked. "I thought he was just, I don't know. Stuck up, maybe. Like too cool to talk to people." She paused. "He's not that at all." "No," I said. "He's not that at all." But I was still only seeing part of the picture. Even now, even as Elias's closest friend, I was holding a version of the story that was incomplete. I didn't know it. I was about to find out. May was when the situation with Patricia changed. I knew something had shifted the day. Elias came to school with the particular quality of exhaustion that is different from ordinary, tired. I had learned to read him over those months. The way you learn to read weather, not by any single indicator, but by the combination of small signs that together mean something. That morning the signs were all pointing in one direction. He was still at the window seat. He still had his notebook open. But his hands were still in a way they weren't usually still. And when I sat down beside him before homeroom and said good morning, he looked at me, and I could see it. "She was in the hospital last night," he said. Before I could ask, he knew I would have asked. "She's okay. She's home now. Dad took her." I stayed with her until about 1, and then I came home and slept for a few hours. "You should have called me," I said, and I meant it. He looked at the window. I didn't want to. He stopped. "I'm still figuring out what it means to let people in." I thought about what he'd said to me on the steps in March. I haven't really thought about what that would look like. He was figuring it out in real time, at 13, in the middle of everything else. "What happened?" I asked. "Episode. A bad one. Some of them are manageable at home, but this one, her mobility, was really affected." He said the clinical words with the fluency of someone who has had to learn a language they never asked to speak. "She's stable. She's home. But the doctors want to talk about adjusting her treatment plan. And that means more costs. And the program I've been applying for, one of them came through. Partially, but it's less than I was hoping." He said the last sentence with a matter-of-factness that broke something in me. Because I've been applying for programs, was still a 13-year-old boy in the school library, quietly fighting bureaucracies designed for adults on behalf of his family. In the margins of a life that was also supposed to contain homework and lunch and the ordinary concerns of 8th grade. "What do you need?" I asked. He almost smiled. "Not quite. I don't know yet. I'm still figuring out the numbers." "Let me help you figure out the numbers," I said. He looked at me. You want to look at healthcare financing with me? I want to look at whatever you need me to look at, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, okay. And that afternoon, in the library, with Mrs. Whitfield's quiet understanding around us, like a kind of weather, we spread the papers across a table, and I helped Ilias figure out the numbers. I didn't know much. He knew more than me already, by miles. But I read, and he explained, and I looked things up, and he corrected my mistakes, and somewhere, in that hour of 2 eighth graders, trying to understand insurance supplementation and income qualification brackets, something deepened between us that I'm not sure I have the right words for. At the end of it, I said, my mom might know something. She works in HR at a healthcare company. She might know about programs, or who to call. Elias looked at me. That expression, the door about to close, and then not closing. Okay, he said. My mom did know something. She knew several things, as it turned out, and she got on the phone with Elias's father one evening in May. And they talked for almost an hour, and she took notes, and she made calls the next day. I am not going to overstate what happened. There was no single call that solved everything. That is not how these things work, and I will not pretend it is. But there were 2 programs my mother identified that the family hadn't found, and one of them turned out to be significant. Elias came to school the morning after my mother and his father spoke, and he sat down beside me at the window seat, and he said, "Your mom is impressive." "She knows," I said, and he almost laughed. And that almost laugh from Elias Monroe was worth more to me than anything that had happened all year. June arrived in 8th grade, wound toward its close with the particular bittersweet quality of endings that are also beginnings, the last days of a year that has meant more than you realized it would. The awareness that the shape of things is about to change. Finals happened, and the cafeteria smelled of anxiety and baked ziti in equal measure, and the teachers got through their last units with that combination of exhaustion and genuine feeling that the good ones always had. Elias was there for the last day with the same punctuality he'd brought to every other day. Window seat, notebook open. But something was different, and I couldn't name it at first. It was something in how he sat. Something fractionally lighter. At the end of year assembly, Mrs. Calloway gave out a few informal awards. The kind of non-competitive recognition that good teachers do at year's end. Most improved. Most likely to be a stand-up comedian, Marcus, by unanimous, invisible consensus. And then she said one that wasn't a listed category. This year, she said, I want to recognize something that doesn't have an official name. It's the kind of quality that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. The kind of strength that's quiet. Elias Monroe, would you come up here? The room was confused. Elias was, I think, more confused than anyone. He walked to the front of the room with that measured pace and stood beside Mrs. Calloway and waited. Elias joined us in September, she said, and for most of the year. I think a lot of us saw him as one thing, when he was actually something else entirely. She paused. He has demonstrated throughout this year a commitment to his family, to his academics, and to kindness toward others that I don't think I've seen surpassed in 20 years of teaching. I don't have a trophy. I have a certificate I made at home last night because I couldn't let this year end without saying it. She handed him a piece of paper. He looked at it. His expression did something I had never seen Elias Monroe's expression do. It came undone, just for a moment, just at the edges. Then he put it back together, nodded at her, said thank you, and walked back to his seat. He sat down beside me, and I didn't look at him, and he didn't look at me, and we sat in that assembly hall while the principal gave closing remarks, and we both stared forward and said nothing. His hand was resting on the seat between us, and after a moment I put my own hand next to his, and he moved his hand so that our knuckles were touching. Just barely, and that was everything. Summer came. I saw Elias regularly that summer, more easily than the school year, oddly, because there were no schedules constraining it. I went to his apartment sometimes. His mother was having more good days, which the adjusted treatment plan seemed to be contributing to. And on the good days, Patricia Monroe was one of the most remarkable people I'd ever been around. She had worked as a high school art teacher before she got sick. She knew things about drawing and color and architecture that she shared freely, the way people share things they love and have had to put down and still haven't fully made peace with putting down. One afternoon in July, she showed me something. Elias was in the kitchen doing something, and she said, "Come here, I want to show you something." And she led me slowly. She was using a cane that summer, more good days but not the same as before, to Elias's room. His room was neat in the way his locker and his notes and his life were neat. But one thing stopped me in the doorway. On the windowsill, arranged in a careful row that extended along the entire length of the window and turned the corner onto a small shelf on the wall, were paper cranes. Hundreds of them, folded from notebook paper, from scrap paper, from napkins, from the margins of old assignments. In the dim July afternoon light, they made the sill look like something had landed there and settled. "He started making them when I was first diagnosed," Patricia said from beside me. "I was scared. He was 10. He read somewhere, I think he looked it up. You know how he is, that in Japanese tradition, if you fold 1,000 paper cranes, you're granted a wish, that whoever you make them for will be healed." She paused. "He's been folding them for 3 years. I stood in the doorway and I looked at the cranes, and I thought of every crane I'd seen him fold in class, in the hallway, between bells, during lunch. Every crane slipped into a jacket pocket. Every crane coming here. 1,000 cranes. The wish for his mother to be healed. From a 10-year-old boy who had read it somewhere, who had looked it up, who had decided that if 1,000 cranes could grant a wish, then he would fold 1,000 cranes, and who had done it quietly for 3 years without ever telling anyone. Because some things you do not do for credit. Some things you do because you love someone, and love needs no audience. How many does he have? My voice came out wrong. He counted them last month, Patricia said softly. 983. I turned. Elias was standing in the hallway behind us. He had come back from the kitchen and found us in his room, and now he was standing in the hall with an expression I had never fully seen before, on his face, completely unguarded, completely open, like a room with all its windows taken out. We looked at each other. "I didn't know," I said. Which was the most inadequate thing I had said in my entire life, but it was the truest. "I know," he said. And there was no accusation in it. None. Just knowing. Patricia reached out and put her hand on her son's face, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and she said, in Portuguese, she had grown up in a Portuguese-American family, I learned later. And sometimes in moments that mattered she returned to it. She said something I couldn't understand, soft and low. He said something back. And whatever it meant, it was between them, and it was enough. "I'm going to take you to the night I mentioned at the beginning. Because you've been waiting for it, and because it matters, and because by now you understand enough to understand it fully." It was October. We were in 9th grade by then, different school, different rhythms, but the three of us, Elias and Marcus and I, had navigated the transition in the way that real friendships do, which is to say, without particular drama. Marcus had made the school's varsity team, which was unusual for a freshman. because Marcus was an unusual person. Elias had placed into the honors track, which surprised exactly no one who had spent time around him. Patricia had a significant episode in late October, the worst one in a year. She had been progressing well, the treatment working, and then, the way this disease operates, I came to understand it didn't. She lost significant mobility. She was hospitalized. Elias's father called me. This is important. He called *me. Not Marcus, though he could have. Me, because Elias had told him that I was someone who should know. I got there by bus, a 40-minute ride across town to the hospital at 11 at night, and I found Elias sitting in a plastic chair in the corridor outside her room, because they'd asked him to step out while the doctors did an assessment, and he'd been sitting there for an hour. He had his jacket on, and his notebook in his lap, and his hands were still. Not the bad kind of still, just still. I sat down beside him. He didn't say anything at first. I didn't either. After a while he reached into his jacket pocket and took out something and held it out to me. A paper crane. Made, from the look of it. Recently his hands were in his lap, and there was a small scrap of paper beside him on the seat. He'd been folding while he waited. I took it. I looked at it. 997, he said. I looked at him. I've been counting, he said. I keep a number in my head, 997, he paused. When I make enough, I don't know. I know it's not. I know it's just a tradition. I know it doesn't literally. He stopped. He looked at his hands. But when I started, I was 10, and I was scared, and I needed something to do with the scared. And then I kept going. Because he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because it was love. Because he was 10 and frightened, and love needed somewhere to go, and this was where it went. Into 1,000 cranes. Into 3 years of quiet, careful, folded love. Slipped into jacket pockets and carried home and set on a windowsill, building one by one toward 1,000. I sat there holding the crane, and I thought of every assumption I had made in the first months I knew him. The quietness, the stillness, the careful rationing of himself. None of it was shyness. None of it was coldness or strangeness or anything the easy label would have suggested. He was protecting his energy for the things that mattered. He was protecting her. He was protecting his secret because the secret was sacred and he wasn't sure the world would handle it with care. That's when the doctors came out. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I want to honor the truth and not dress it up into something tidier than it was. The doctors said she was stable. They said the episode was serious but manageable. They said they wanted to discuss additional therapies. They said, and this is the part I want you to hold, they said that her overall trajectory, given the treatment adjustments made earlier in the year, was more positive than they had anticipated 6 months ago. The words they used were cautiously optimistic. They said she was stable and would likely be able to go home in 2 days. Elias sat very still through all of this. His father was there by then. He'd arrived 20 minutes before. Still in his work jacket, still carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who works double shifts and loves his family with everything he has and still lies awake at night, feeling like it isn't enough. He listened to the doctors and nodded and asked careful questions, and when they left, he sat down beside his son and he put his arm around him, and Elias leaned into it. Just slightly, and they sat like that in the corridor for a moment. I had moved a few feet away to give them space, and that's when I felt it in my hand. The crane. Elias's number 997. I looked at it, and I understood all at once, in the way understanding sometimes arrives, that this was what the whole story had been. Not a tragedy, not a rescue, not a before and after. It was a love story. The most ordinary and the most extraordinary kind. A child who loves his mother, who finds a way to carry that love through years of fear and exhaustion and silence, who folds his love into paper, because what else do you do with that much of it? Who goes unfolding day after day, crane after crane, not because he knows it will work, but because love doesn't ask whether it will work. Love just keeps going. I thought about every quiet kid I had ever ignored, every person I had ever assigned a simple story to because looking deeper seemed like too much work. Every time I had taken the first sentence, new kid, probably shy, and treated it as the full paragraph. The world is full of people carrying things in silence. And silence looks, from the outside, like so many different things: shyness, coldness, arrogance, strangeness. It almost never looks like what it actually is, which is a person trying to get through something larger than they should have to carry alone, trying to get through it with as much dignity as they can manage, while the rest of us walk past and build our comfortable, lazy stories and go on with our day. I folded the crane, closed in my hands, and held it. Patricia came home 2 days later. On the Saturday after she was discharged, I went over with Marcus. And we brought food. Marcus had his mother make arroz con leche because Marcus's mother expressed love through cooking, and once she knew about Patricia Monroe, there was no stopping her, and we sat around the Monroe family's kitchen table, and there was food, and there was talking, and there was laughing. The real kind, the kind that doesn't ask permission. At the end of the afternoon, when Marcus and I were getting ready to leave, Elias walked us to the door. And just before we went out he said, "Hey." We both stopped. "I counted today," he said. He looked at me. 1,001. I looked at him. He almost smiled. Not almost, he smiled. Elias Monroe, who had almost smiled for almost a year, would carefully rationed his visible self for so long that full expressions were something I had only seen in rare, unguarded moments. He smiled, full, complete, like a window opening. "One extra, for good measure," he said. I didn't say anything. Marcus said, "Okay, I'm not crying," which was a lie, and nobody called him on it. Elias nodded at us and went back inside. Marcus and I stood on the landing for a moment, not quite ready to move. Then we walked out into the October afternoon, that same in-between air, cool enough for a jacket, warm enough to question it, and we didn't say much on the way to the bus stop. There wasn't much that needed saying. I had a crane in my pocket. I've kept it. I don't know if I'll ever fold it into something else or whether it should just stay what it is. Sometimes, things should just stay what they are. I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then I'm going to let you go. Last spring, several years later now, long after Hartwell Prep, long after the corridor and the counting, Elias told me that, in the months after he started getting help, after my mother's calls, after the programs were found and the treatment plan changed and the weight distributed more evenly, he had thought about why he'd held it all alone for so long. And he said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about since. He said, "I thought if I told people, they would look at us differently, look at her differently. Like she became the illness instead of herself. And I didn't want her to be the illness. She's my mom. She's the one who taught me to fold a crane, actually, when I was little, before all of this. She showed me once, and I remembered. And then when I needed something to do with how I felt, I remembered that. She had taught him 2 fold cranes. She had given him, in some ordinary moment, years before anyone knew what was coming, the exact tool he would need. and he had carried it forward and used it in the dark, in the quiet, alone, not knowing she'd given him a lifeline. Not knowing, perhaps, that she'd given him more than a paper folding technique. She'd given him a way to love her back through the hardest thing, when love felt like the only thing he had. I think about that. I think about what we give the people we love without knowing we're giving it. I think about the tools passed forward through ordinary moments that become extraordinary later. In ways we never anticipated, in hands we never imagined holding them. Elias Monroe was not the quiet kid. He was never just the quiet kid. He was a person with a story so large that quietness was the only container he had found that was big enough to hold it without spilling. He was a child doing the work of an adult because love doesn't wait for you to be old enough. He was a son folding cranes in stolen minutes, in classrooms and corridors and library corners, building, one careful fold at a time, toward a wish he never spoke out loud because some wishes are too important to say where someone might hear and dismiss them. He was everything I had decided he wasn't, in 30 seconds, on the first day of 8th grade, from 10 feet away. I think about you, whoever you're listening to this, and I wonder if there's an Elias in your life. Someone you've assigned a simple story to. Someone whose quietness you've read as something it isn't. Someone who is carrying something in the margins of their days, something large and sacred and wordless, while you walk past and think, asterisk, probably just shy. Go back, look closer, not with pity, not with rescue in mind. Just look closer. Ask how they're doing and mean it, and wait to hear the real answer. Sit on the steps and say nothing until something becomes sayable. You might find that what you thought was absence is actually presence. That what you thought was withdrawal is actually protection. That what you thought was nothing is actually 1,000 paper cranes on a windowsill, folded in the dark, one by one, because someone loves someone more than they know how to say. And sometimes that is the whole story. And the whole story is enough to break you open and put you back together again, better than you were. It was for me. Asterisk for every quiet kid who was never just quiet. For every person folding cranes in the dark. Asterisk and for Patricia Monroe, who taught her son everything without knowing she was teaching him anything at all.